In 3, 2, 1.
Uncle, 1 minute. Hello, ma'am. Good morning. Can you hear the voice?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Can you hear me okay? Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. In just 2 minutes, we are going to start.
Okay, just let me know when. Will someone introduce me?
So,
This already is going on. So
Hello, ma'am.
next,
There's a very bad echo.
or intentional injuries. Project, and then let's continue. And about the awards, awarded as backward solution of the modern project.
Hello, everyone. It's beautiful, a beautiful day here in Sydney, Australia, and I'm delighted to be with you now, joining you for your conference. My name's Rebecca Ivers, and I'm head of the School of Population Health at UNSW, University of New South Wales, Sydney. I'm also associated with the George Institute for Global Health. Today, I'm talking to you about global musculoskeletal research, and I'm talking to you about my experiences in obtaining funding and delivering research, some of which has been in India in collaboration with partners and India, and very importantly, that partnership piece. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself before we start. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit firstly about how to build and fund research programs, and then you can see here that I'm here in Ahmedabad with Nihal Shah, but I'm going to talk to you today about what's important about research programs as you build them. One of those things is quality, the quality of the research, the potential impact of the research, but also equity. And that's important in considering what research you do, who do you do it with, and whose capacity do you build, because we must always consider equity, who is going to gain the most impact from the work that you do, and who are the people in most need. And that's something that we often forget very much about in research. So when I first started doing research, I was a clinician. I trained as an optometrist in Australia. That is a 4-year, highly competitive undergraduate degree. And I moved from metropolitan Sydney to a very remote community in the Northern Territory of Australia, which you can see here, this red circle, it's right up the top of Australia here. So I was very isolated, and I worked in a remote community with the people that lived there, as well as Aboriginal people that lived in the area. And very quickly I realised that there was something wrong with the way in which we administered health, that the healthcare system did not work effectively for those people in greatest need. And there it was, the Aboriginal people living in remote parts of the country. So I went back to study. I decided I'd like to do some research to better understand how best to treat eye disease and health system issues for Aboriginal people, but I realised I needed more training. So I went back to Sydney and enrolled in a Master of Public Health, which is a coursework master's And I studied epidemiology, study design and interpretation, biostatistics and data analysis. And I very carefully chose the subjects that I did in my master's to make sure that I could do research. I also did some subjects in health policy and health economics. As part of my master's, I also had access to research. I was able to complete a research project with the supervisor, and that led to a publication in a peer-reviewed journal. Now, I'm telling you this, it's very important because it allowed me to then enroll in a PhD, which was the next step of my pathway. But for those of you who are interested in doing research, a Master of Public Health is a very good way to start because it does give you very good coursework opportunities in the key subjects and skills that allows you to build these skills that you'll need to do research. I then enrolled in a PhD. I was very fortunate to gain an entry to a PhD program, and I did work. My research work was on poor vision. After all, I remember I trained as an optometrist, but also falls and fracture in old people. So I completed many papers looking at the relationship between poor vision, falls, and hip fracture. I collected data on hip fractures from over 3,500 older people who were enrolled in a large longitudinal study of eye disease, the Blue Mountains Eye Study, and I analysed that data. I also analysed data from the baseline cross-sectional data that was collected as part of that study and the longitudinal data. I also had data from a separate, very large case control study that had been conducted in New Zealand examining risk factors for hip fracture. Now, again, I'm telling you why this is, I'm telling you this because it's important. It was important because I was able to join as a student on a large funded study with a very eminent group of researchers who come up with some ideas, had the research funded, and I was able to come on and learn research skills and be trained by some very expert people on an already funded study, and that resulted in very high quality publications. So you can see here, I then published a number of papers on that relationship between poor vision as a risk factor for falls, and really you might say that's pretty simple. If you can't see, you're more likely to trip and fall over and break your hip, but this was in the early 2000s. These were the first papers that were published on this subject. I looked at poor vision as a risk factor for falls and for hip fracture, as well as other papers on the incidence of poor vision, accuracy of self-report of fracture, diabetes as a risk factor for fracture, and other risk factors for osteoporotic fractures. These are some of examples of some of the papers, and we were able to publish in really excellent journals, the Journal of the American Geriatric Society, American Journal of Epidemiology, and Injury Prevention, amongst others. This then moved on to more trials. So I was then invited to join as a collaborator in some randomised controlled trials looking at vision screening and treatment to prevent falls in older people. And these were funded by our Australian Government Medical Research Funding Agency, the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia, which is NHMRC. We had two trials around this time, a study looking at improving vision to prevent falls in older people. So we did vision screening of older people who were at risk of falls, and then they were randomised to either receive treatment if they had vision screening and treatment or just usual care. That was not effective. The people who had vision screening and treatment mostly got new glasses, and that in fact made them fall over more often. So that was a strong lesson learned. The second paper here, which you'll see was published in the British Medical Journal, was we gave people who were at risk of falls single vision glasses rather than bifocals or multifocal glasses. So again, it was just looking at the different types of refractive error that you could give to stop people falling over. So that was important too, but both of those trials again were large collaborations with very eminent scientists who were far more experienced than me. We were able to get funding for these trials and publish them in very good journals. And also these results all had high impact. So the papers that I had published from my PhD were some seminal papers on the relationship between poor vision and falls. And those and the other trials informed development of clinical guidelines in Australia and UK and also globally on management of poor vision in older people at risk of falls. And it also led to other fall prevention trials. At the moment, we're just finishing another randomised control trial of an exercise intervention for older people with poor vision. So that work has continued. following that, I was very fortunate to gain a position at the George Institute for Global Health Australia when that started up, which was around 2000, so 22 years ago, which is why you'll see why I'm so old now. I was a young postdoctoral fellow, moved to the George Institute. But our focus was on global health, and global injury was really the work that I was working on. And many of you will know injuries are a major cause of death and disability worldwide. They account for 8% of the global burden of disease. In 2017, there were 521 million non-fatal injuries, and over 5 million people died from injury. And the main global causes of injury death are road injury, self-harm, and falls. Injury death rates are actually twice as high in men compared to women. So, it's a major issue for men globally. Most of those deaths are in low and middle income countries, but there's also a high burden in high income countries. So that was the work that we started on. And you can see here from this slide, this just shows you the burden across the world. And you can see for women on the left in red, men on the right in blue, and you can see far higher burden for men. You can see down here in South Asia, which is where India will sit, that all those causes of injury are higher for men than women, except for, in fact, fires, which is higher in women. The only place in the world where injury rates for women are higher than for men. That we set out developing up a major program of work with collaborators around the global burden of injury. Now, trauma and injury is very expensive. In China, many decades ago, it was already estimated at $12.5 billion. In Vietnam, a high proportion of injured people suffer catastrophic health costs and impoverishment. And that's the case in India as well. Costs of trauma in India, with collaborators at PGIMER, we did a prospective cohort study at 3 hospitals in North India and followed nearly 3,000 people for 12 months following injury. And the median out-of-pocket expenditure for road traffic injuries was $160. So that's $160 out-of-pocket costs. And there was 50% of the poorest wealth quintile suffered catastrophic health expenditure, which meant that they spent so much money on their healthcare that they were at risk of being impoverished. Major issue in India. And again, these papers led by both Jagnor and Prinja, published in BMJ Open in 2015, really informed some. You can go and look that up and have a look at some of that work. We also know that there's an important need for improved rehabilitation across the resource poor settings. There's little to no rehabilitation post-hospital discharge. As many as you will know, you have very strong physiotherapy departments in hospital. People are called back into hospital for physiotherapy, but for many people that's not. It's not available unless people are able to live close to the hospital. And of course, lack of rehabilitation, as you will all know, can inhibit recovery, leading to preventable lifelong disability. So our experience, my team has conducted global research with a focus on China, India, Australia, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. We do research on the burden and cost of injury. We do cross-sectional and cohort studies, looking at risk factors for injury and outcomes following injury, and then large-scale, high-quality trials of prevention across those areas as well, including detailed process and economic evaluation, and trials of trauma care and rehabilitation. We have a WHO, World Health Organization collaborating centre in injury prevention and trauma care at the George Institute for Global Health, and recently authored Step Safely, which was the World Health Organization technical package for prevention of falls across the life course. And if you're interested, I suggest you look that up. So we have a focus on unintentional injury, as I've said. Now, some of the work that we've done in India, and I'm going to talk to you now and highlight some of the work that we've done and how it was funded, because I think that's important to you as researchers who'd like to know how to get your research going. This large cohort study was funded by a small grant from the Road Traffic Injury Research Network, but it was largely driven because of local staff. In Chandigarh, we only had $25,000 US for that study, but we were able to collect data up for 12 months for 3,000 people. So a huge effort from local staff. Another study, Repair, a cohort of 300 people admitted for isolated fracture of the lower limb to assess their rehabilitation following lower limb injury, and we followed people up. This study was part of the Australia-India Trauma Systems Collaboration, which was funded by the Australia and India governments, aiming to improve systems of trauma care. And this is only one aspect of that study. These are some of my lovely collaborators that we worked with in developing up the intervention and the observational study. And you can see there were many collaborators involved in this study over several years. So that included phase 1, an observational study in 3 sites to look at standard care for adults with lower limb fractures. And then phase 2 was development and evaluation of a home-based rehabilitation program in a randomized controlled trial. It was supposed to run across 3 sites, but in the end, due to feasibility and poor funding, we only ran it in 1. And that was funded by the Indian and Australian governments, Australia-India Strategic Research Fund. As I said, this was a small study that was part of a much larger collaboration with many investigators. So, great opportunity. We are now finishing off another very large study called Enormous. This is a study in adult patients presenting to hospital with musculoskeletal trauma, looking at the incidence of major complications at 30 days. It's prospective data collection, and we're recruiting 40,000 patients globally, of which 37,000 have already been recruited. And that's been across India, China, Thailand, Vietnam, and multiple countries in Asia and South America. And we've had many sites across India for this study. This, again, was funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research with Canadian collaborators, the National Institute of Health in USA, and the National Health and Medical Research Council in Australia. But it does have collaborators from all around the world, including multiple investigators in India. And you'll see here, these are the sites around the world that this study is being recruiting for. It was, and again, the genesis of the study is important. It started up with a pilot in India, the Enormous India study, which was way back 10 years ago. Again, just highlighting the length of time it takes to build these kind of large studies. Nearly 5,000 people in the pilot study, and that data were published in the journal. Again, many investigators from India, as you'll see here. And thank you to any of you in the audience that were collaborators on this pilot study. That then led to the main study, and then again, these are the hospitals that are involved in the main study now for this grant, which again has finished up, and we're just talking to collaborators at the moment about publication of the data. But again, a very large collaboration. Significant trial. It will give us robust estimates of the incidence of major complications following traumatic injury, but importantly, identifying the factors associated with major complications. So it will be important for clinical care. We are also doing observational studies of hip fracture in China. Again, similar, understanding that best practice, there's a significant evidence practice gaps for hip fracture in resource poor settings. And so we have done 2 studies in China, one comparing standard care for hip fracture against orthogeriatric co-managed care, and then we're just coming to the end of a prospective study comparing standard care against orthogeriatric co-managed care in 6 sites. And to date, the results have shown that orthogeriatric care or co-managed care provides better outcomes. It reduces time to surgery. People are more likely to get fall prevention care, better pain management, and reduced mortality, importantly. There is a suite of studies that we are conducting as well. So, and again, just to give you a bit of a sense of how these studies are funded. 4 PhD students, 3 Chinese PhD students, all looking at data in China. And this is important because within countries, many, as you know, in India, you are all expert researchers with expert clinical links. So building the research is about just training researchers and ensuring everyone has strong opportunities for research training. So 3 PhDs based in China on risk factors for osteoporotic fracture, understanding rehabilitation post-hip fracture, and then understanding implementation of a fall prevention program for older people in the national health system in China, and other students looking at barriers to implementation of protocol-driven care for hip fracture across Asia. Again, all of that work in China has been funded by internal China hospital research funding and PhD scholarships. So there's been no external funding for that big body of work. At the moment, we are developing multiple trials, one under review at the National Institutes of Health Research in the UK, which is a large-scale implementation trial of a simplified model of care for hip fracture across Asia and looking at health-related quality of life. And that will have sites in India. We have collaborators from AIMS for that study, but also working in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. I'm also working with a Canadian collaboration on Hip Attack, which is about a randomised controlled trial of rapid surgery to reduce time to fracture for older people with raised troponin. So people who've got heart injury, if we get them into surgery quicker, they seem to have better outcomes. And then another study we are working on, which is based in Australia, which is looking at variations in care for diverse populations in Australia for hip fractures. So understanding for people who don't have English as a first language in an Australian setting, what quality of care do they get? So all of that, what I want to do is come back to talk a little bit about what does that mean for research? How do we do it and how do we prioritise it? Well, the approach is the research prioritisation is really important. How you make decisions about how you come up with research questions. It's important to work with stakeholders, patients, other clinicians, end users, so that your patients to understand the priorities around research and approaches to prevention. You need to always make sure that you have a good, strong research question. When you are designing interventions, making sure that you're doing that in partnership with end users and multidisciplinary teams and co-designing interventions, not just making something up yourself because you think it's a good idea. It's about working with a broad range of people to understand from a patient perspective what is needed. We also have a strong focus on equity. So when we look at routinely collected data or we understand survey data, understanding the effect of data, understanding different populations. So what is the impact on the poor? Who is at most risk? Where can the gains, where can the greatest gains be? And that might mean looking at, so you can look at that in your routinely collected data. When you're looking at papers that examine the issue, look for the effect on different populations, where the greatest gains can be made. There's also a need to move beyond approaches focusing on individual behaviour change and actually looking at the system. Many of the challenges that we face in healthcare is not because people do the wrong thing or people don't know what to do or people need better education. It's because the system doesn't support effective change. We might need to fund more physiotherapists. We might need better team-based care that involves a collaborative approach, which needs support for team-based approaches. So ask ourselves the question, what does the health system need and what research do we need to answer that? And also a very strong focus of our work is in growing the next generation of researchers. So a strong focus on research training, including project management, and that means growing PhDs, project managers, trial staff, and clinical researchers to understand research and how to do that. So when we come back to funding for you as researchers and clinicians in India, where might you get research funding from? Firstly, looking at local resources, you'll have local research students, your own students in physiotherapy colleges or from universities, students doing undergraduate or postgraduate degrees, research degrees like PhD or masters. And often you'll find some hospitals have small seed or pilot funds to allow you to do some early work. There are some national level funding agencies in India. The Indian Council of Medical Research is clearly the preeminent research funder, but also the Department of Biotechnology and Science Technology. Unfortunately, a lot of the funding is geared towards infectious disease, some towards non-communicable disease, but injury and trauma care is poorly funded in Australia, in India, many other places. So it's always a challenge. So advocacy to some of your large funding bodies around funding schemes for musculoskeletal research, I think, is important. There is also some opportunities for corporate social responsibility funding in India. So it is worth noting that injury and rehabilitation funding through CSR sources is also on the rise. So it's also worth looking for opportunities with big companies in your regions to see if there are opportunities to get research funding from corporate, so as part of the corporate social responsibility funding streams. With respect to international funding agencies who may fund rehabilitation research or musculoskeletal research, particularly in India, there's the big donor, international donors, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, though again, they historically have not funded musculoskeletal research. They tend to focus on infectious disease. The Global Challenges Research Fund in the UK does focus challenges in low-income settings, but again, it depends on the scheme and the time, and it's very competitive. Bilateral aid agencies, so US aid, UK aid, do occasionally fund research. The World Health Organization, so if you have connections with the Southeast Asia office, the CRO region, which is in Delhi, World Health Organization, there are occasionally tenders around small pieces of research that may apply. Other really wonderful sources for research are from the UK, the National Institutes of Health Research in the UK. And again, they do have a very large focus on global health research, but one of the great benefits is that it's not just for people living in the UK. As long as you have strong UK collaborators, you can apply from India as a principal investigator for some of these funding schemes. And I'd encourage you to look at these schemes, likewise with the Wellcome Trust in the UK. And there is substantial funding available from the National Institutes of Health in the USA, which can also fund work in India. Some grants can be led by non-US citizens. They also have the Fogarty International Centre for International Training, which is also good for training of capacity and fellowship training, though again, that needs to be led with strong US partners. We've also had much research funding for work in India, funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia. But unfortunately, as Indian investigators, you can be named on those grants and we can use it for funding in India, but you couldn't lead that from India. You would need to have an Australian collaborator. So the NIHR, the UK source, is really probably the best one to do. It's critically important that Indian investigators lead their own research. You best understand the priorities and the needs of your country, and so that they are really important opportunities for building research. This is from a paper, and you can see the citation down below from Lalit and Rakhi Dandona, published in the National Medical Journal of India in 2017, which is about Indian funding sources. And again, just highlighting the type of funding and the funding type. Again, pretty similar to what I've said. I think the issue is mainly that it is challenging to get rehabilitation and musculoskeletal funding. It is possible, however. So when you build a program of research, where do you start? Well, I think firstly starting small, doing local exploratory or pilot studies. As I said, focus on high burden, high impact topics. There's always a tendency to do things because it's easy to do it in your lab or in your local unit, but it's good to just start thinking about what are the important issues. Do systematic reviews to uncover the gaps, talk to people about priority setting to best understand where the gaps are in the areas in which you're working. Putting collaborations is critical to building high quality research though. Building local strong teams. There's so much expertise in India. Look within country to find people that are attracting international funding in your area and make connections with them. Attending international conferences and making connections is also good, and local conferences, of course, and virtual is more common now, so more affordable. If you have the opportunity to join multi-site trials and trials with international collaborators, do that. Working in multidisciplinary research teams is also important. So as physiotherapists, joining in research projects with surgeons, anaesthetists, nurses, other researchers and other people of different multidisciplinary backgrounds is important because, again, that will help you to answer bigger questions than just within your discipline. And I'd also encourage you to work across your institutions and universities, stretch out your networks beyond your local area and build those collaborations. And of course, reach out to experts in your field for advice. So finally, the final tips, to identify key gaps for research, do systematic reviews, do workshops with policymakers and clinicians and patients, co-design the solutions when you're looking at designing interventions. Journal quality matters, so publish in the best journals that you can, the quartile 1 journals, and many of the international journals do have support for publication fees for people from resource poor settings, so it is sometimes possible to get fee waivers. If you're looking for big trials and building international grants and research studies, having high quality international partnerships with strong local leads will help with funding. But I don't think ever underestimate the skill and the knowledge that sits within India. It's perfectly possible to actually develop strong local teams. And if you're interested in global health, read the big global health journals, PLOS Global Health, BMJ Global. There's a lot of rhetoric and discussion around the importance of independence and sustainability and building strong local teams and not being dependent on Western researchers and to drive research and certainly to drive research agendas. Driving your own research agenda is important. So one of the really wonderful things that you can do as part of your physiotherapy association is driving your own research agenda and then working with international researchers to get funding for it. But you set the agenda and work with partners to make that happen. I'd also encourage you to consider where the greatest gains can be made, consider the health system, consider health equity, who is in most need, where are you going to get biggest impact, where are you going to save the most money. And finally, good research and research partnerships take time. They're not things that are built overnight. My research I started as a researcher in 1998. So this body of research has taken decades of work and decades of collaborations with local and international collaborations. I have 19 PhD students that I've graduated over that time, all of whom are now building their own research pathways. And I have numerous students from India, China, Vietnam, who are forging their way now, and I'm very proud of them. So thank you for listening to me today. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and I wish you all the best for your conference.